BK Live boasts an impressive roster of guests. We've spoken with political leaders, cultural icons, even everyday New Yorkers. But never have I ever sat down with one of the world's 100 most inspiring women. One of them, at least, according to Salt magazine. From our Booming in Brooklyn deep dive into aging, I'm happy to welcome a woman who is flipping the script on the way that we look at our growing into our age and ourselves. She's the author and activist, Ashton Applewhite. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So we really appreciate you being here, and we appreciate the perspective that you're bringing to this topic. So I'm going to start by asking, when did you first start lying about your age?
Truthfully, I never lied about my age, but because I'm an incredibly late bloomer. You know, I didn't start writing till I was 40, and so I've been sort of catching up with myself all the way along. But the reason I started writing about aging, which typically I also only realized in hindsight, was because I was afraid of it.
Afraid of it.
Yeah.
Now, is that fear something that diminishes as we get more mature, or does it just start to sit heavier and heavier?
Well, that's one of the, I just assumed, I started with all these incredibly negative assumptions about aging, even though my own getting older wasn't so terrible, but I assumed, that was anomalous.
Yeah.
And one of the things I assumed was, in addition to, of course, it sucking to get older, was that the older you got, I literally imagined the shadow of the Grim Reaper, coming, casting a longer and longer shadow over your bed.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way.
Well, I know
the longer people live, the less afraid of dying.
Well, you wrote in the book about this fear you had of being this drooling entity beneath some botanical print in a ward somewhere shipped away. But do you think that is a pervasive thought, or that we all think we're the exception to the rule? It's like, oh, this feels good on me. Like, I'm not going to be like that person.
That's a complicated question. I think one of the reasons my work is getting the response that it is that as we age, even if you've never thought about it in political or cultural terms, there is a discrepancy, like this cognitive dissonance. Whoa, I thought everything was supposed to be terrible, and that's actually, the physical deterioration is real. The loss of beloved friends, that's real. But honestly, absolutely nothing else is inevitable or universal. And as we get older, we realize, it's very different. It's much more nuanced. It's much richer. And of course, there are losses, but there's also, things that we gain. Things that it's an additive process as well as a process of diminution. And it's not that I'm no Pollyanna about the negatives, but I'd like to tell the whole side of the story.
So you said something about thinking in terms, and that reminded me of something else from This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. That ageism, as a phrase, was coined 5 minutes after sexism. But for some reason, well, it may be ironic that sex has risen to the level of culture where ageism seems to be something that's on the back burner. But they're in a race to both be diminished, but it seems like sexism gets a lot more headlines.
I think that's true. We know it's true, but I think, ageism is catching up. I do think that, there's a ton more interest in it. It is starting to be talked about. Every time I read an article or whatever about, the struggle against racism or discrimination on the basis of gender and, race, et cetera, sexual orientation, every so often age is in there, and I'll know we've really gotten somewhere when age is always included.
It takes its place, right?
Because
with the rest.
we know that diversity is a good thing now.
Yeah.
I think even in conservative, circles, even in the business community, we know diversity is good for business.
Right.
So the idea that age is a criterion for diversity is frankly blindingly obvious, whatever your, ideological orientation is, and I think we're going to get there.
It's blindingly obvious, but also glaringly absent from the depictions of diversity. We have every rainbow that is implied, but we don't often see gray in that rainbow.
Yeah. I have a friend who works in workplace diversity, and she calls it the shoe test. Look under the table, and if everyone's wearing the same kind of shoes, you got a problem.
Really?
If you're striving for diversity.
Yeah.
And I say the same thing. Hair is a little obvious because lots of people color their hair for good reasons and bad, or, as I see it, you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
No judgment, I swear to God. But, if everyone is the same age, and, how can you not think about it these days, I think, in terms of activism? Mm-hmm. And whatever your cause happens to be, if everyone around the table is the same age, you're missing out, just as if everyone is the same color.
So why do you think it's so not in the front of our minds if we are out here at the moment's notice rallying against homophobia, against Islamophobia, garden variety racism, all of these other isms, but I can't telegraph to you what it's like to be me as you can't me to you and all that jazz, but we're all gonna get old. That's the equalizer.
We're all gonna get old.
But no one is marching against ageism, especially not a broad coalition of all age folks.
Well, two points about that. One of the many interesting things about ageism is that it is the only line, if you will, or tangent where we start at disadvantaged as babies and children, progress into advantage, and then become marginalized again. So that's a universal experience. I think we just haven't gotten to it yet. I will be delighted to blame my generation, although that's a really ageist thing to say, because how could one generation, how could anything be true of an entire generation, of course. But I think the baby boom, everything in this field is double-edged because aging is living, it's life itself. That we are the healthiest, wealthiest, best educated generation in history. Which is, so we have a lot of power, and we are finally, I was born in 1952, so I'm dead center of the baby boom. I think it is finally dawning on my colleagues that no matter how much kale we eat, or Sudoku we do, or whatever,
those things help, yes.
Kale helps. Yeah. Exercise helps. Sudoku makes you good at Sudoku. It's not clear that it's not clear that brain games work. Okay. Attitudes towards aging play a big role in this. Mm-hmm. But I think the nuanced bit is that there's a lot of denial there. Gee, I don't look like my grandmother looked when she was 64. Right. And it's true that we are aging somewhat differently, but it's also true that 60 is the new 60. It's not the new 40, right? And that it is, the root of ageism is denial that you are aging. Mm-hmm. And as long as we imagine that we are somehow exceptional, we're not going to actually acknowledge it and deal with it in all its richness. So I think there's a lot of denial on the part of baby boomers, but I think we're getting old enough that the denial isn't working so well anymore. And I'm really hoping that our activist roots from the 60s kick in.
So how does ageism hinder young people?
Ageism is any judgment about a person on the basis of how old you think they are. Mm-hmm. So anytime someone says, gee, are you sure you can manage that? Do you know enough? Kids,
on either side of the spectrum.
On either side, right. It's any judgment. And so ageism casts a shadow across our entire lifespan. And another example is, your 20s are tough. Mm-hmm. The message in this society is that the 20s are your peak life because it's all going to start really start sucking really soon, right? And that is a tremendous burden. When you're in your 20s and you're just trying to figure stuff out, and even in your 30s where you're supposed to, figure out your career, get married, start a family, start saving. We have a long time to do that. And I think one of the reasons that ageism is coming to the fore is because of this massive global demographic shift of population aging. There are, thanks to, mainly to clean water and antibiotics, more people started surviving to adulthood. Right. And so the American lifespan increased by 30 years in 1 century. Yeah. That's only, part of that was just more people surviving to adulthood, but it is a gain of about 10 healthy years.
So in your book, you have these great factoids that pepper the chapters, and one of them that stuck with me is only 4% of folks over 65 are actually in a care facility, what we think of as like an old folks kind of home.
Nursing home. Nursing home. Assisted living encompasses nursing homes. But only, I assume the odds of ending up under that bad botanical print.
Just a foregone conclusion.
Well, not foregone, but that the odds were decent.
Okay.
I don't know what I would have said, maybe 30%, and it's 4% of the entire population over 65, and it's dropping.
And those people are still working and doing it. Despite what you call in the book what's perceived as the outside world as the ew factor.
The ew factor. I know. Where does that come from? There's a scholar whom I really respect named Cynthia Rich, and she says that this idea that older bodies are repulsive should be familiar to us from narratives about racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia, that the physical being of the oppressed is something we should draw away from, right? And being told that, you are unattractive. And that's, of course, what the Black is Beautiful slogan was a corrective to. And, if we can think of older men as distinguished, then the idea that older women are devalued and ugly, clearly a cultural construct.
Yeah,
let's push back against that one.
Yeah. So how do you do that when an entire industry, livelihoods, billions of dollars are predicated on the fact that you are meant to erase your wrinkles or do this to your hair or go to surgical procedures? Like it's an entire industry.
It is a massive industry. It's, I forget how many $1 trillion it's projected to be by 2025. Cliche alert, all change starts within. It starts with accepting the fact that you are aging and that you can't possibly look the way you used to look, and that as long as that is your goal, it reinforces the idea that the most important thing about you is your appearance. It reinforces the idea that the younger you is more valuable than, and that who you are now is a lesser version of who you are.
Right.
I don't feel lesser.
Yeah.
And I think most of us don't if we think about it. And it, reinforces also, patriarchy, that all these beauty norms, capitalism,
Right.
It tells you need to spend a tremendous amount of money fixing something that is not a problem. So the first step is, of course, to accept the idea that, which is hard. There's a tremendous amount, messages against it, that you are getting older, and to embrace it and to not buy into this narrative that you are lesser and that you are unattractive and that you are asexual. That gives you confidence. And I think we all know that the biggest aphrodisiac in the world is confidence, and for evidence, look at your friends who get laid, They're not the prettiest,
Right.
They're not the thinnest,
They're
they're
just
not
out
the
there.
youngest. They're the ones who know
Right.
that their lovers are
out
lucky.
there. Yeah.
And so we just need to reject that narrative as we need to reject the basis of all discrimination.
So on the theme of that, in the last 60 seconds, I'm going to ask you to deputize me into being a person who is an old person in training. How do I make that leap?
I think by wanting to be one, you're most of the way there. It's just a trick of the mind. It is simply to acknowledge that you will someday get old. At whatever remove psychologically is bearable to you, because this is a big shift, and we have to do it at our own speed and in our own way, right? But the minute you acknowledge that you will get old, you stop seeing old people as other, because that othering is the basis of all prejudice. The weird part about ageism is that the other is your own future older self.
Yeah.
So instead of seeing that as something other that you don't want to think about, you go, down the line, that's going to be me. And then it makes you actually look at older people instead of distancing yourself. It makes you less afraid. And then you can start to see things that older people do that you think are really great and wonderful, or stuff that you don't want to do.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been instructive. And to keep up with Ashton, visit thischairrocks.com and isthisageist.com. Again, thank you so much for being here, Ashton Applewhite.
My pleasure.